Welcome, everybody. My name is Dinda Elliott. I'm Director of Programs at China Institute. And as you know, we produce programs throughout the year about business, technology, arts, and culture, aiming to equip our audiences with everything they need to know about the world's new superpower. With the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative and more assertive stance on the global stage, the world is striving to understand China's economic and political ambitions. There's been tremendous investment in Latin America, of course. Did you know that the Belt and Road Initiative extends to the nations of the Caribbean as well, though? We're going to hear about that today from three fabulous speakers. Earl Carr is founder and chief executive officer at CJPA Global Advisors and an adjunct instructor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. Earl has expertise in banking, wealth management, consulting, geopolitical analysis, U.S. foreign policy, international development, and of course, China. He recently edited the book From Trump to Biden and Beyond, Reimagining U.S.-China Relations. Rasheed Griffith is a senior fellow with the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. And he is also co-founder of Merkle Hedge, a trading firm focused on cryptocurrency markets. Rasheed is the host of the China in the Americas podcast, and his policy research focuses on China's geoeconomic and financial engagement with the Caribbean. He's testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Roseann Lake is going to be our moderator tonight, and she is a former Beijing correspondent and the author of an amazing bestseller called Leftover in China, The Women Shaping the World's Next Superpower. Her work and reporting has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the Guardian, and the Atlantic, among many others. Roseann currently covers Cuba for The Economist. Just a bit of quick housekeeping. We are going to take questions from the audience at after about 45 minutes. And so please do type your questions. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So please do type your questions in, and we hope to get to them. And please join me on the screen. Welcome to Earl, Rasheed, and Roseann. Over to you, Roseann.
Thank you, Dinda. Thank you for that warm welcome. Welcome to Earl and to Rasheed. We're so excited to have you here today. As someone who has spent a fair amount of time in China and in the Caribbean, and who has always been fascinated by what that combination looks like, if I see people who look like they could be Chinese investors walking around the streets of Havana, I stop whatever I'm doing and I go interrogate because I find it so fascinating. So we're very lucky to have you tonight to sort of pull back the curtain on what's going on in the Caribbean. We know that there's a lot, and you both spent a lot of time in the region, and we're looking forward to seeing what you have to say. So I think a good way to get started is to just sort of give us a lay of the land. We know that there is Chinese money going into the Caribbean. Where is it coming from? What does it look like? Whoever would like to start, please kick us off with some good energy and some good insight.
Rasheed, would you like to go first? I'm happy to start. Okay, wonderful. Well, I think what's wonderful about this conversation is, first and foremost, I would like to give a special thanks to Dinda for organizing this extraordinary event, along with the China Institute for hosting us. I'm also delighted to have a number of very dear friends on the call, in addition to Ambassador Shorna K. Richards, the Jamaican ambassador to Japan, Ambassador Wayne McCook, Gerard Johnson, Keith Collister, as well as members from Barbados, including David Bulbulia from the Confucius Institute. So welcome and thank you so much. And I should also say that, when I think of laying the land, I should just share a quick anecdote. So my father is from the Caribbean. My father's from Jamaica and served as Jamaica's ambassador to China. And, one of the most interesting memories I have is at the age of 8, I took my first trip to Jamaica, and my father took me to this place called Alligator Pond, which is in the southwestern part of Jamaica, and it's a place where it's beautiful nearby the beaches, and it's known for bami and fish and a variety of other things. And so I'm there. My father leaves me on the beach, and I'm roaming around, and I made a ton of local friends from kids on the beach. And about an hour later, my father comes back, picks me up, and we're heading home back to Mandeville. And I'm really excited. So I turned to my dad and I said, I'm trying to practice my patois. I have to chat the patois with him. And my father says to me, Earl, just stop. And he says, Earl, let's be clear. You are more American than apple pie. All right. And it was really difficult for me because I wanted to feel Jamaican. I wanted to be treated as Jamaican because the first passport I ever held was a Jamaican passport, but I did grow up in the United States. And so, Roseann, to your point, in terms of setting the scene, I think what's great is that I can be able to share my perspectives as a person who's grown up in the United States, but as someone who has strong linkages to the Caribbean, was born in Panama, and in addition to that, but conceived in Jamaica on a stormy night, I was told, and then proposed to my wife, who was in the Bahamas. Proposed to my wife in the Bahamas. And so with that, I would like to say that, it's critically important to understand that the Caribbean is not a monolith, first and foremost. And when you look at Chinese investment to different parts of the Caribbean, whether that be Jamaica, whether that be Guyana, or other countries, I think it's really critically important to understand the diversity of what something like 7 billion in loans and investments to primarily 6 Caribbean countries, what that represents. But with that, I'll go ahead and stop here.
Okay, so that was such a tease. You said 7 billion to 6 different countries. We really wanted to get you into numbers. We really wanted you to get into the numbers, and we're going to hold you to that. But we're going to go over to Rasheed for a little bit so he can sort of lay the ground for us and share any personal backstory. We must confess to all of you that none of us is in the Caribbean right now, but Rasheed will be in Barbados this evening. So over to you, Rasheed.
Yeah, I am from Barbados. I do live in Panama. So that's one thing. So the Chinese investment in the Caribbean is, as anyone would understand, very multivariate. And you have to differentiate between Chinese companies that operate on a profit motive and Chinese policy arms that operate on geopolitics and more political intentions. So when you think about loans are a mixture of both, because Chinese companies, they want to build infrastructure projects, and then they go and seek loans from the China XM or the CDB. So you have to keep that in mind as well. And Chinese operations have been all through the Caribbean, Dutch Caribbean, English Caribbean, British Caribbean, and French Caribbean as well. And you also have to keep in mind that sometimes these projects are led by private bodies, private people as well. In Antigua, there's some really fascinating special economic zone being developed. This is led by a former Chinese billionaire who is now Antiguan via the Citizenship by Investment program. You have some interesting industrial parks being developed in Trinidad, co-led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Trinidad, and also some Chinese companies based in mainland China. In Barbados, you have this very nice electrification plan by the government, which is primarily being led by Chinese commercial interests. So Chinese cars, Chinese buses, and so on. At the same time, you have a lot of business activity in British Caribbean, what we call the offshore markets, with financial operations, legal cases going on between Caribbean judges, Chinese companies, and American investors. So all these things are happening throughout the Caribbean. And I just mentioned all these kind of wide variables because we can probably go in many directions in our conversation.
And if I could, Roseann, if I could just add one other important aspect to that, I think it's also critically important to understand when you talk about Chinese investment between retail investors, institutional investors, as well as state-owned enterprises. They are very different, multifaceted. And just to give you an anecdote of the disparity, if you were to go on Baidu, which is a very Chinese, it's a search engine, and if you were to do a search, Chinese investment in the Caribbean, the first thing that you would find are actually passports. So actually, you could, for people who want to buy a foreign passport, that is the #1 thing that you will find on Baidu. But that's obviously very different from actual Chinese investors, like I said, state-owned enterprises and or corporates that are investing in the Caribbean.
Right. It would be great if we could sort of dig a little bit more into that, because obviously we're looking at very different profiles. We have state-owned enterprises. Of the two, what would you say the majority of the investments are? So you mentioned $7 billion. I know it's really hard to quantify these things, but is the bulk of that money coming from SOEs, or is it retail money? What's sort of the breakdown there? And are there areas that SOEs tend to prefer, say infrastructure, tourism? Is it sort of, can you sort of neatly divide what they're into? Is there some overlap? If you could just both give us a little bit of color on how that breakdown, comes across in terms of investments, I think that would help paint a picture.
Rasheed, would you like to go?
Sure. So SOEs don't build projects in a vacuum. They are contracted by, in Caribbean case, these bigger projects by governments, and government are private, public-private partnerships as well for PPPs. And also the mechanical note is that oftentimes a Caribbean government might want a project to be built, a bridge or a hotel, Bahamas case a massive hotel, or some roads and so on. And they will work with the Chinese companies, and the Chinese kind of will help the loan process along. That's not because of some kind of, let's say, incapacity. It helps move things along much faster if the SOEs help with work with the policy lenders in China. So oftentimes the loans that's the mechanism the loans come to Caribbean. But oftentimes the actual projects are initiated by government stakeholders in terms of the large loans they're referring to.
No, the only other thing that I would add on is that when you look at particularly, a number of companies and their strategic investments, they also include a variety of different projects from stadiums, like in cricket in the Guyana, for example, as well as large, minerals. Bauxite is a huge mineral that is very important to Jamaica's economy, as well as if you look at Guyana, the importance of oil and how that oil has fueled the logistics ecosystem in Guyana is very important for a number of Chinese investors.
Yeah, and I'd love to follow that up with a question on, how local governments and how local people respond to this sort of investment. Obviously, something like a cricket stadium isn't going to go unnoticed. It's a very thoughtful investment. But we do have a poll that we'd like to offer to the audience. It's one that Earl very kindly came up with. I think we're able to sort of put it out on the screen now, so you can, there we go, take a look. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are on China's increasing interest in the Caribbean. So there's just a few questions, 5 questions that you could go through. And maybe we will change your minds over the course of this conversation, maybe not, but it's just an opportunity to think a little bit about, the questions that we're going to be looking at. And we'll sort of let you take a look at that. Feel free to respond at your leisure as we sort of continue to chat. So yes, please. I mean, these are the sort of details that I love, right? I mean, I've got a few from my days in Havana. The closest, and probably spent the most time researching, was a restaurant. And it was actually, Xi Jinping had gone to Cuba. He shook Fidel Castro's hand and he said, you need a proper Chinese restaurant in this city to welcome Chinese businessmen, because we want to invest in your country and we want to do more things. And I sort of followed the evolution of this restaurant, which ended up being disastrous. You had, architects from Beijing who were very frustrated with Cuban workers, with materials not coming through, with there being no concrete. And I always found it so entertaining to sort of hear the Chinese sort of, cursing at them in Chinese and the Cubans cursing back in Spanish in an endearing way, I suppose. But, that sort of colored my view of what this experience is like, right? Culturally, the Caribbean and China are very different. They're similar in some ways. I guess Cuba is an extreme example, right? Because the internet is very slow and is the polar opposite, right? There's internet everywhere. So seeing these workers not be able to get online, not be able to get on WeChat. I was talking about it. They're like, we don't know how they do it here. It's just completely different. It gives a whole new meaning to Maman Lai, right? It's just like, it's everything is very slow. So I just find that color from these investments so interesting. And Earl, I know, some of your clients private clients that, you know, you'd mentioned in previous calls sort of say they get excited about investing, but they have sort of no clue where to start, right? And they need expertise to sort of help them orient their energy and their funds to make sure that they're not, you know, that they're not, that they're being sensitive to the environment that they're investing in. So I don't know, just some examples of what that's like while I don't know how we're doing with the survey here. Has everybody, I mean, obviously you don't have to answer me, but hopefully many of you have had a chance to sort of go through the questions and answer, but we'll carry on.
Aaron, yeah, great points. And I love your anecdote. I was smiling as you were telling that story. Aaron, who is managing the poll, he'll see a percentage, which will show like how many people have taken the poll. And typically we'll close the poll when we have about 85 to 90%, you know, participation rate. So maybe give people another like minute or two, especially for those who may be just joining us for the first time and seeing this poll pop up. But I loved your story, Roseann, and in particular, when I think of, you know, the cultural differences and helping Chinese to understand why, you know, the Caribbean is such an important place to invest. I think it's important to understand, you know, when Wen Jiabao first came up with this notion, encouraging Chinese companies to go abroad and go out, I think that was really a huge foray to really promote Chinese investment abroad. You know, at the time when I worked in China in 2006, you know, there was so much competition internally in China. And, you know, Chinese companies were like, all right, the competition is so fierce in China, it's probably easier for us to invest abroad. So I think that was one of the huge impetuses behind encouraging Chinese companies to go abroad.
Rasheed, is there anything you want to add to that? Okay, got it. Should we take a quick look at these poll questions? Let's see. Let's see. All right, we've got the results coming through. I don't know if, okay, everybody can see them. It seems like almost half of the audience is concerned about China's increased economic engagement. Be interesting to know why they're concerned. Let's see, how do you, concerned? Okay, there is concern. We will try to allay your concerns. Let's see. Okay, the stealing of intellectual property doesn't seem to be a big issue. Economic trade wars seems to have won out there. And most optimistic, clean energy. Okay, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Some of the clean energy products. So we mentioned some mineral extraction before. Is that something maybe we should switch over to talk about clean energy exchanges between China and the Caribbean? That might be sort of a hopeful a spot for engagement.
Sure. Rasheed, do you want to take this one since I just responded last?
Sure. So I think there's too much weight oftentimes placed on clean energy engagement as engagement. So the biggest benefit that small open economies of the Caribbean get from China in terms of clean energy is just the existence of Chinese companies that make alternative energy products. So for example, the largest solar power panel producers are also Chinese. They don't produce things for the Caribbean. They produce things. And it happens that because they make it so much cheaper that the Caribbean can afford to buy them. And this much outweighs any of the current plans that the Caribbean governments have for actually getting a green economy going. Again, when I say plans, they have these urges towards green economy, but they're not very laid out in a KPI metric-driven fashion. There is perhaps an exception in Barbados, perhaps, but the government there has a much bigger impetus towards doing some electrification. So the buses, the public sector buses are being replenished using BYD, a Chinese company, BYD electric buses. Although I'm actually not sure where these buses are made, because I know that BYD has a plant in Lancaster, California. So I'm not sure if it's actually from California to Barbados. So it should make sense, but I'm not sure exactly the route they take. And of course, the MG cars, electric cars, are hybrid that are being sold in Barbados. Now the government is kind of increasing those as well. And of course, there's other plans to do green plans for the Barbados. again, you do have to keep in mind that the fact that we can afford to buy these things because Chinese companies that exist on for their own profit reasons is the real driving force, I think, benefit of these green energy technologies from China.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that. One of the areas that you are starting to see Chinese companies in China in particular being more cognizant about is this whole notion of ESG. There is a huge focus on green finance, particularly with the Asian Infrastructure Bank. I've had the pleasure and honor of having a personal relationship with President Jin Lichun, the president of the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And I know that is a clear focus for the bank when they look at financing various projects throughout the Caribbean and the developing economies. I think also when you look at the whole ecotourism kind of sector, that is another area that I think is really promising for how countries in the Caribbean want to engage Chinese investors as well.
So would it be fair to say that overall, the investments that we're seeing from China are benefiting local economies more than corrupt local officials?
I think you do have to be careful with that statement, because it's not just investment from China. These are projects the government wants and China's giving money for them.
Right.
So the pathway of how these things grow is important. It's not China's coming in and trying to change something, it's the governments themselves. So any slowdown in projects is on the government side, any acceleration in projects off again on the government side. So you have to be careful of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think you make I would 100% agree with Rasheed. And I think that, I think time will really tell ultimately how these investments play out and who ultimately benefits from them at a grassroots level in terms of local Caribbean communities. When I speak to friends and or Chinese investors, one of the interesting things that you will often hear them say is, oh, I'd like to invest in a hotel in the Caribbean, or I'd like to invest in an insurance company. But then when you ask them, well, do you plan to like own and operate that? Or do you plan to bring in your own technical know-how and expertise? And the answer is, well, not exactly, So I think it's really important that we understand that dynamic, and that historically, Chinese companies have taken a lot of flack for bringing a lot of Chinese labor into developing economies, and that has not really sat well with a lot of developing economies. You saw this model in a number of African countries in particular, and so a friend of mine, Gerard Johnson, mentioned a statistic that if you look at countries in the Caribbean, actually Jamaica has the highest number of Chinese labor than in any other countries in the Caribbean. So I think it's really important that perceptions here that investment is actually going and benefiting local communities. That will be a huge litmus test to how countries in the Caribbean perceive this investment.
So would you say it's too early? Has there been any opposition, or is it too early to sort of see? Has there been any opposition versus, I don't know, say US investment, right? The Caribbean's in our backyard. Maybe we invested more heavily in the past. China is doing more of it now. Have we seen any opposition?
Again, opposition from Caribbean people on the street or the government? What
either one. I mean, they're very different, right? So either one.
So Caribbean people oppose all things, really. Most things that involve change it come with some kind of deterministic opposition. They oppose U.S. investment, they oppose Canadian investment, they oppose Chinese investment, they oppose Venezuelan investment. But there are also more people that are pro these things. Right? So of course there are people who oppose it, but that's not really around the question. I think though that the idea of this crowding out effect is a question about, well, did this more Chinese money or more Chinese origin money decrease US origin money? Well, likely not, because US origin money kind of stopped a long time ago. Most US money comes in via IMF loans in some countries. That's not the best way to get money very often.
Yeah, right. And I would just add on to that, I think it's critically important that the investments that are utilized to build these large infrastructure projects are done well and that the clear positive externalities are reflected in the lives of the Caribbean people. And I'll give you one clear example of that. When I was young, I would go to Jamaica with my father. My grandfather would pick us up at the airport in Kingston, and we would drive 4 hours from Kingston to Mandeville, which is in the country, to where my grandparents live. And the roads were these I remember the windy roads that would take us like around the hill, like around the mountains, and you thought you were gonna like lose your life as you turn a corner. The Chinese came in and invested almost 270 million in what's called the north to south highway that linked Kingston to the Ocho Rios tourist regions and other parts of the coast. And that 4-hour drive now is an 1.5-hour drive. And so I think it's critically important that, infrastructure projects like that, they make a huge impact, when people can see the clear and inherent positive externalities on how they help, the average ordinary citizen. And I think that if more of these are done in a way in which the countries in the Caribbean do not feel that they are susceptible to things like debt trap, I think that there will be more of a positive receptivity towards these types of investments.
Sure.
And I should say, just to preempt perhaps questions may come, the debt trap narrative is empirically baseless, and we can get in that if you want to, but it is important to realize that the idea of the Chinese debt trap is a bit stale.
Fair. And you mentioned earlier, Earl, you were talking about, one of the people you work with planning on building a hotel. Were you planning on staffing it up locally? It would be interesting to hear a little bit about, if one of your clients is planning to build a hotel in the Caribbean, who's the target audience? Are we looking at Chinese tourists? Are they also going to be benefiting from this Jamaica Superhighway? Is this also part of a bigger plan to, for tourism, or are we still looking at Americans? This could be Chinese investment, but where are they going to be making their money from?
Great question, Roseann. And I think that, as I alluded to earlier, if you were to do a search on Baidu, one of the most popular thing that comes up is a foreign passport. So I think, the consciousness as you see Chinese, particularly people from middle income families are becoming more wealthier, this notion of traveling abroad is gaining more traction. So I think you are going to see more Chinese tourists traveling abroad and spending more money abroad in the Caribbean and other countries as well, and regions as well. So I think clearly that there is a notion that this type of tourism will definitely be supported from an ecosystem of Chinese, people traveling abroad. Absolutely.
And could that be part of larger geopolitical goals? Is the idea, is the bulk of this investment commercially driven, or are there other motivations here? Again, the backyard of the US, obviously it's a wonderful economic opportunity. And, the Caribbean it was never really, we had talked about this, Rasheed, you had said, the Caribbean it never really was allied, completely with the US. It didn't feel any allegiance to it, but could that sort of be part of what we're seeing, right? Stadiums, roads, tourism. Are there geopolitical motivations here in addition to the commercial ones? I see it in Cuba, so I'm curious to hear.
There's always geopolitical goals for any government policy in the world. So, of course, however, the thing to remember, again, is that a lot of these large projects are not just Chinese projects that came out of the blue. Caribbean governments, in most cases, initiate these projects. So it's not just like Chinese money from a black box. There's government projects are financed by Chinese money. So yes, it's origin Chinese money, but the project impetus in most cases, especially large projects, are Caribbean government choices.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I agree 100% with what Rasheed said, and I would just add on to that. When you look at other components like the Chinese renminbi or the Chinese digital currency, I think the critical story here is financial inclusion, right? If you look at various islands in the Caribbean, there's no way that you can have a bank on each of the island, right? And so what you have is a situation where the renminbi is being offered to the countries in the Caribbean, which is enabling people to be able to transact in this currency at a cheaper cost than the US dollar. And then you're also seeing, coupled onto that, American banks and Western banks withdraw from the Caribbean within the last, decade or more. I mean, I worked at HSBC Bank, and then I also worked at Morgan Stanley. And if you look at their presence in the Caribbean, I mean, when you look at the return on investment, it just, for them, it just didn't make sense. They would rather utilize and invest in developing economies like China because they can get a higher ROI. But what does that mean for, I mean, the only American, to put this in perspective, the only American bank that is in Jamaica currently is Citibank, only one that I know of. And so I think that there are very huge implications for the renminbi and digital currency to have an impact from a financial inclusion standpoint. And I know Rasheed knows this subject and topic very well.
Yes, and I do disagree with that point, actually. So there is a lot of conversation about the prospects of RMB or even ECNY or digital RMB in the Caribbean, but Caribbean's balance of payments are primarily USD denominated for obvious, maybe not obvious. Most of the goods come from the US, shipped from the US. Most of the services are, priced and invoiced in US dollars, and even globally, most things are invoiced in USD. So the balance of payments in the Caribbean are primarily USD based, and that's good, actually, because it actually gives more access to global markets. I don't see RMB having a much big impact anywhere in the Caribbean, not because it, deterministically cannot be impactful, but the way how Caribbean banking systems are structured, the markets to which the income is driven from tourism in most cases, is USD invoice. And I actually don't think there's much benefit of having RMB settlement systems in the Caribbean, ironically enough, unless you dollarize the entire economy, because that's the only way you're gonna have enough liquid markets to get good pricing RMB and USD. But I guess that's a very niche topic we will dive into. I think that the problem of financial inclusion, kind of Earl brought up, is a substantial problem, but it's not a problem that can be impacted in any substantial way by any kind of RMB or Chinese digital currency.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rasheed. Maybe I'll just give one example, Roseann, where this plays out. So when I worked at HSBC Bank in China, the current Jamaican ambassador, Courtney Rattrie, asked to have a meeting with me, and he said, "Look, Earl, if we were to pursue a loan from HSBC in renminbi at better favorable terms, how would that look like, and could we pursue and look at something like this that could benefit, that could help transform various communities, particularly low-income communities in Jamaica?" And so we had a meeting with my boss, which was the head of commercial banking, and we discussed it. What are the terms? And I think one of the reasons why the Jamaican government wanted to pursue this is because they wanted to compare, could they get a loan at a more favorable rate in renminbi vis-a-vis US dollar? So I think these types of transactions could be appealing to countries like Jamaica and other countries in the Caribbean.
Okay. They could definitely be appealing. I mean, we all know the reasons why they're appealing, but the problem is that the Caribbean countries are already so bad that very oftentimes your loan portfolio, again, a bit very technical, your loan portfolio, even if it's RMB, won't be that much beneficial if your underlying balance sheet is so crippled.
Is it worth talking about crypto at all, since we're talking about traditional banking and I mean, and Rasheed, this is an area of expertise for you?
To be honest, I don't think it has an impact in Caribbean.
Okay. I know that it does in Cuba for remittances, but that is a very, very special case. Given sanctions, it's a much easier, and Western Union not being able to operate. In terms of financial inclusion, it is having an increasingly important impact, and as a store of value, right? Because Cubans are basically cut off from the world financially. It has made a big impact, but I understand that that's not representative of the rest of the Caribbean. So I just thought I'd throw it out there. All right, well, since we have this sort of debate over dollar, renminbi, what actually is more important in the Caribbean, let's talk a little bit more about the US and their influence there. I mean, I don't want to sort of keep beating this drum, but it does seem to, to be important to address what this does mean for the US. Earl, you had brought up some really interesting information about sort of fake accounting, right? So, goods that are coming from China pass through the US and end up in the Caribbean. And so they show up on our balance sheets as being traded with the Caribbean, but that's actually not the case. So are we aware of this? Is it something that we're concerned about? Or are we just sort of looking at the numbers going, oh, well, that looks good. We're doing a lot in the Caribbean and sort of going our merry way, while China, always industrious, is sort of getting things done, right? We see that they've done this in other regions. Is that true in the Caribbean? Are we asleep at the wheel? Or, is there more to give credit to for the US for sort of continued engagement in the Caribbean? Or is, as you said, that sort of a bygone story?
Yeah, that's a great question, Roseann. And I think, one of the fundamental issues when you look at investment in the Caribbean is a word called AML, anti-money laundering. And whether that be on the Cayman Islands, whether that be in a variety of other countries in the Caribbean, it is, when I was a banker at HSBC, you have to do two things. You have to do something called KYC, which is know your customer, and KYCC, which is know your customer's customer. And so I think, these are issues that are very important with respect to US regulators, how, information is processed, understanding who the ultimate beneficiaries are of the companies that invest in the Caribbean, and that will continue to take place, for the foreseeable future. In terms of geopolitics with respect to the United States, I think it's very important that the United States is not particularly approving, or they're looking at this Chinese investment with a high degree of skepticism, right? And there are two fundamental components here. One is, like you said, it's in the United States kind of backyard, and two, the important implications that this has for Taiwan. Right. So if you look at a number of countries in the Caribbean and or Latin America that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, when China kind of poaches or severs diplomatic relations, when diplomatic relations are severed, the United States makes it very clear to these countries that this is extremely frowned upon from the United States U.S. foreign policy angle. And Rasheed and I, we had a great discussion, prep session talking about, where did this came from? And I think historically, there was an implicit agreement with President Ma Ying-jeou. And I had the honor and pleasure of meeting Ma Ying-jeou, both in the United States, in New York City, and in Taiwan, that when with respect to relations with China, China under President Xi Jinping would not kind of take diplomatic relations as long as kind of, there was an adherence to the 92 consensus, and that, Ma Ying-jeou kind of, continued to further strengthen economic and political relations with mainland China. At the same time, kind of, Ma Ying-jeou had to strike a fine line with kind of, balancing, and not make it seem that he's placating to kind of mainland Chinese interests. However, when Tsai Ing-wen came into power and did not acknowledge the 92 consensus, you saw a very clear strategy where President Xi Jinping is very active in taking diplomatic relations from Taiwan. So I think these two are critical core essential issues that relate to U.S. foreign policy objectives.
And do we see that, thank you, that was a great answer. Do we see that the countries that are sort of more aligned politically or sort of less tolerant of Taiwan are getting the most investment from China? Is there sort of a correlation there? Is it like, we will shower you with our investment if you, I'm not sure it's that clear cut, but it's worth asking.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful with that, because oftentimes, if your country doesn't politically recognize another country, there are structural limitations on how much money you can invest anyway. So it's not simply of, oh, you switch to PRC, therefore you get money. Right. It's, oh, you switch to PRC, therefore space has opened up for money to flow in. And of course, there are some cases where the switch does follow like an explicit echelon or so on, as in case of Grenada. But you also have to keep in mind that there is always a risk of talking about small countries like their toys. You hold the American backyard and the portion away from, portion to China. It's not that straightforward. Um, and there, in many cases, just that the countries, for various their own domestic reasons, have a reasons to switch.
Sure.
It could be commercial, they could be developmental, they could simply just be political. Like for example, in St. Lucia, of course, St. Lucia is still a Taiwan ally for the time being. But when they had their constitutional review committees, independent committee by the foreign affairs, they were like, "Why are we doing this Taiwan thing?" Right? So there's differences in amongst these things. I don't see how in 5 years Taiwan has any allies in the Caribbean. That's not because Taiwan's a bad ally. Taiwan is decently enough, and their diplomacy is quite good. They promote the allies, they promote what they're doing, and try to encourage Taiwanese to go to the different Caribbean countries. They talk about them all the time when they do have bilateral and they are invited agencies. But for just very boring opportunity cost reasons, Taiwan will not have any allies in the Caribbean. That's no fault of Taiwan and no benefit of PRC, but squarely the best interest of Caribbean countries. It's almost the ironic thing of, especially the US brings this up, and the US does a lot of Taiwan promotion in their foreign policy in Caribbean. But then the honest question to ask is, if Taiwan is so important, why does the US recognize Taiwan? It only have these small countries that apparently are not so important. You don't have to develop and get PRC recognition. You have to keep Taiwan. That's a kind of an unfair statement.
I would just add on to that, being married to a Taiwanese wife and living through this, these debates, I would say two things. One is I would agree 100% with what Rasheed said. I mean, I think countries, my father was the last Jamaican representative to recognize Taiwan and then sever diplomatic relations with Taiwan to then recognize mainland China. And I think what you saw shortly thereafter were a number of economic incentives as well as scholarships that were given to Jamaican students to study in China. But then at the same time, you'll also see a number of other countries that no matter how much money China will provide in terms of economic incentives, they continue to recognize Taiwan and continue. And I think St. Kitts and Nevis is a great example of that. I was the relationship manager for this account in Taiwan. And if you look at the recent election in St. Kitts and Nevis, the candidate had a very strong pro-Taiwan voice. And as a result, St. Kitts continues to recognize Taiwan in addition to other countries. So I think it really does depend on the situation.
Okay.
I think though that oftentimes the reasons why these countries still recognize Taiwan has nothing to do with the countries, but the politicians. So, St. Vincent, for example, has a politician, not really government.
Right.
So I think anyone can understand what I mean by that. And there's a very good paper on Paraguay-Taiwan relationship where there's lots of interviews with the military and the farmer government people, and did some very good research on Taiwan. Taiwan, I have a friend who he's part of the lodge and Taiwan and so on. And like when the Latin American government people go to Taiwan, they have their buddies in Taiwan and they are controlling the country. There's no reason why they will switch when they have their buddies on the other side in Taiwan. And it's not necessarily the most democratic place to consider politics. At the same time, St. Kitts is a particularly unique situation where St. Kitts, a lot of their revenue comes, we keep mentioning it all the time, we haven't actually gone into it, from passport sales, or the more accurate term, sales by investment. And a large proportion of the buyer are Chinese people. It is illegal to have more than one citizenship if you are Chinese. Now, if St. Kitts and Nevis was a Chinese ally, of course, you have very normal information sharing type things. It'd be kind of have to well, we know we're kind of breaking your rule every single day, but they're not going to do that. So when you maintain Taiwanese allyship, you don't have to go through that drama with PRC and still take all the money from the PRC citizens. That's a very unique issue.
That's a fascinating little workaround. It actually saves you trouble because you don't share as many records with China. Just, I'm cognizant of the time. I want to open it up to questions. Feel free to send them in the Q&A boxes. The audience, I'm happy to open this up to questions. And while you're sort of getting those in, I had one more for you both. I'd love to hear more about the passports because that's fascinating. What are the countries that sort of offer sort of the most enticing terms? What does it cost? If I want to be, if I want to be a citizen of a Caribbean country, what is it going to cost me? How do I do it? And also, what are some of the most popular countries for this to happen in? Yeah, let's start with that actually. And, we'll keep an eye out for questions as they come in too.
I guess I'll go then. So there are
Sure.
5 countries that do it: is Dominica, St. Kitts, Antigua, St. Lucia, and Grenada. And the general cost is about $100,000, plus about $30,000 in due diligence fees and a few other government fees as well. That's for a person and spouse, and up to, I think, 2 children under 18. And there are some different additions if you have like a grandparent or you have more children. And that is if you give directly to the National Development Fund or as different bonds, like in the COVID bond solution, for example, similar price. You can also buy property as a higher price, about $400,000, say in Antigua, for example, but it's around 100K plus, fees. And it takes maybe around 5 to 8 weeks to get the passport. So it's a fairly quick process. Oftentimes, a lot of the promoters are Chinese, so they're in China, like thousands, or they promote the passports. So that's why you see a lot of this stuff on Baidu, where they actually make these advertisements, so they make a lot of content in Chinese to buy these passports. And it's a known thing among Chinese literati. That this is a big issue, and not issue, a big opportunity. And oftentimes people just buy the passports because they don't want a Chinese passport. They want a passport has European visa freedom. They want a passport have Canadian visa freedom. They want to have, for example, a passport where they can get their money out of China, or they want their children to have a non-Chinese passport. Various reasons like that. So that's why it's a fairly big market.
We're getting into one of my favorite topics. I love it when, when Chinese money influences the market for things. So I have to ask, if in countries where there are a lot of Chinese people buying these passports, have you seen property prices go up because they want to spend time living there? Where do they send their children to school? I've seen this happen in California because I've done a lot of research on the Chinese demand for surrogacy. Following, more liberalized birth control policies, you have a lot of older Chinese families, or not so old Chinese families, coming to seek an heir through surrogacy. Yeah. And the neighborhoods where the clinics are, property has gone up, right? So do you see that there? Do you see those
people don't actually live in the country? Okay. They typically buy like a timeshare, is it by property, or they just do, as I said, the direct national. So for example, you can invest in the National Development Fund of these countries. Clean but simple investment one time, and that's your thing. You don't typically come to the country. You typically go to Europe, or you typically go to Canada, or you typically go to England.
So
no, not really. Also, there is you check some data, you can see, for example, there are a lot of Kittians that buy Turkish passports, but of course they're probably not Kittians. They're probably people that bought a St. Kitts passport, then use that passport to buy a different thing. So like a passport arbitrage. You see some of that as well.
Yeah. You Chinese people doing that? Sorry.
Oh, we don't know, but given that this is a big proportion, is likely.
Yeah. I would just add, Rasheed, did you add Dominican Republic? Because that's also
I did.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I don't include that in like the normal Caribbean list.
Okay. Yeah, there's a number of Dominican Republic is another country that you're seeing a lot of Chinese buy passports from as well. That was one of the number one countries that came up. And like Rasheed said, you could actually like get it. You actually do it in the UK, and you can get your kids to get passports as well. So that's also another country that I just wanted to mention.
And is this a relatively new thing, or has this been going on for a long time that you could by citizenship?
Dominica started in 1980s, so and
Okay.
they're the oldest. They're the first country to officially have a citizenship by investment program. Our case, one of those two. Yeah.
Okay, so it's been an option for a
I
while.
was when I was a banker at HSBC in New York City in 2012, I actually came across a friend who had mentioned that a number of American accounting firms had also started offering this service as well. And that was news to me. I didn't know that, but a number of American accounting firms also offer this service to Chinese as well.
Yeah, a lot. Of course, it's of course not only Chinese people that buy the passports. Americans do it too. I know some Americans do it, but that's for taxes. That's not for citizenship reasons.
Different
You
reasons.
don't
Yes.
you don't want to pay international taxation if you're outside America.
Right. All right. So can we, if there are any questions, please have any. Let's see. We do have.
Yeah,
coming
we've
through.
got one from Dinda.
I've been neglecting them.
And they're about 5 or 6 or so.
Yes, we do. Oh, you can see them. Would you?
Yes.
All right. Would you like to pick one and answer? Let's do that.
Sure.
I have to read them first.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a very valid one from Michael, and I actually did want to ask you about this. We see that there are investments that pan out, that do very well, and others that don't, that are done in haste and that are done with borrowed money, and don't necessarily end well. Are we seeing that? I mean, we know that China has been burned in a couple of places. I've seen it in Venezuela. I've seen it in Cuba. Can we have you address projects that don't necessarily pay out?
There have been a number of projects in the Caribbean that, from an kind of ecological standpoint have not kind of met the grade in many ways. There have been a number of complaints in Jamaica that I've read online, which is the country that I'm most familiar with. And so that has definitely been a point of contention. China, when you look at a variety of different large infrastructure projects, has had a number of reputational issues, even from the high-speed rail that we saw in a number of countries to airports that have been constructed in different parts of Africa. And you can see the basic semblance of these issues in the Caribbean. There's no, that's just kind of a common issue that you will find in various developing economies when you use Chinese labor and or Chinese technology in certain situations. I'm putting a link to the book that I published, and we talk about this in particular in our book with greater detail in a number of chapters.
Rasheed, did you want to add anything, or should we move on to the next one? I just want to be fair. Maybe we'll do them chronologically. So there's a question there about, anything or?
No, fine.
No, okay. Anything about Taiwanese investment or business presence? We talked a fair amount about Taiwan politically, but investment or business presence?
Yeah, there is Taiwanese business. It's minimal because, for obvious reasons. But it's funny because even in St. Kitts, this is a strident Taiwan ally, the prime minister was like, we do more business with China. Casually said that. So there you go.
Earl, you're good?
Yeah, I'm happy to move on. I know we've got a number of questions.
Yeah, we don't have much time. Yes. Interesting question about second and third generation Chinese in the Caribbean. I know there's some of them left over. They left the Cultural Revolution and found themselves in Cuba.
Yeah,
they have fascinating stories, but I don't think that's what you're asking about. So
it's not all the. It's mostly not all the Caribbean. There are 2 particular countries where it's more prominent. So of course, Jamaica. Perhaps Earl will have more comments on me on that one.
Yeah. When I look at my relatives, as well as other friends, when you look at second and third generation, I think, there's 2 things. One is their ties to China as time goes on become lesser in the majority of situations. You know, you see the second generation in many cases cannot speak Mandarin as well as, you know, their parents, and that's just a byproduct of, you know, being able to in Chinese what we call 入境随俗, right? Like, you know, when in Rome, you do as the Romans. And so, you know, even though there are a number of, like, there's something called the China Benevolent Association in Jamaica, and they do a fairly good job of trying to promote Chinese culture and the language. You know, as the generations come, you know, as you know, they live longer in Jamaica, it just becomes harder to establish those ties. And I think that's why a number of Chinese investments have continued to promote more Chinese culture and language exchanges. I mentioned the scholarships, particularly to a number of students in the Caribbean. That's something that is very, very important from a government to government standpoint. And I think that those types of investments will continue to play important prominence in the future.
Rasheed, did you have anything to add, or would you like? Okay, great. So a question about the passports. It is fascinating. I think the answer to this question is yes, but Rasheed, you were the expert on this. So is there an advantage for those still recognizing Taiwan that they don't have to report on the issue to China?
These days, not too much, because of course China can't force people to share information. Just that these newer countries like Antigua, for example, only started in 2013. They were already Chinese allies by that time, PRC allies. So does that say kids coming in the game for a while that they have a lot more dependence on that market than these other countries do. However, I don't think that will prevent kids from switching. I think it's what has kind of caused some friction to switch before then. Of course, there's also the institutional interdependence between the Kitchen government and the Taiwanese government, not the party per se, but the government itself, the public sector, people in power, you know, and so on. But yeah, I don't think it's a particular advantage anymore. However, there was a fun thing that happened recently. It was last week, maybe even this week. I think last week, the Taiwanese office in St. Lucia essentially was promoting Taiwanese to buy St. Lucian passports. So, you know, that's a fun thing that happened recently. As a method of people-to-people engagement.
A bit of muscle flexing there.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, as if you look to the next 10 years, you know, I think that Taiwan understands that just when you look at the sheer, you know, China's economic and political, you know, prowess, you know, Taiwan is aiming to focus more on trade with these countries in the Caribbean and more broadly. I think Lithuania is a great example of their adeptness to be able, you know, when the president came out and said, you know, we're looking to establish a trade office, you saw the amount of pressure that was put on the president to then essentially, you know, apologize for doing that, right? Because, and why did China do that? Because they're trying to stop a precedent. They understand that once that happens, Europe, other countries will kind of follow suit. And so I think, you know, the strategic calculus for Taiwan is how do we engage countries in the Caribbean with more focused, you know, emphasis on trade that brings more tangible benefits, you know, that meet essentially the bottom line, and not so much the diplomatic, you know, kind of realm, because at the end of the day, they know they can't compete head to head with China. So I think that's going to be the strategic focus going forward.
That's an excellent point.
I think that's I think that's a misreading of the Slovenian situation as it persists and the Caribbean as well. Lithuania, in many cases, was just flexing so they could get more NATO support from the US. How do you influence the US? Well, help it do something else. And as you can see, NATO then started getting more influence in Lithuania. And Taiwan was really just playing the PR game. Again, there's no fault of Taiwan. I'll play the same game as other Taiwan as well, but that's not very replicable, especially in the Caribbean, where we are an import economy, and Taiwan doesn't produce the things that we have to import. So trade will never be a way Taiwan can beat China in the Caribbean, even if they want to, which it doesn't seem like they actually trying to do that.
Yeah. I wasn't referring to quote unquote beat China in the economy. I was just saying that I think going forward, Taiwan's strategy and focus will be more focused on trade and tangible benefits vis-a-vis the diplomatic route, because they know that they'll never be able to really compete head to head with China in terms of diplomacy.
I think that's actually the only thing they can compete with, because that's the only thing they're good at in terms of China relative to the Caribbean. China is not that good at Caribbean diplomacy. Taiwan's fantastic.
Right. Taiwan needs to play to its strengths. Diplomacy is its strength, and so it should stick to that, because with everything else, it just can't compete with China. That's very obvious. Yes. Okay. A question about China and Cuba. I'll do this really quickly. I'm not seeing an increase in collaboration. There were really high hopes, but Cuba doesn't have any money, and China learned that the hard way. They were sending, and it depends who you sell to. So if you're selling to the Cuban government, you're never going to get paid, because the Cuban government doesn't have money. If you're selling to the Cuban military, i.e. anything related to tourism, because the Cuban military controls tourism, you will get paid. So I've spoken with many a Chinese businessmen in Havana who say, yeah, we only sell cars, or we'll sell buses, the big BYD buses. We will sell them, but we won't sell them to the government. We'll sell them to the FAR, ultimately the Cuban armed forces, because they control the tourism industry, because they actually have money. There are lots of very frustrated Chinese investors in Cuba, unfortunately, who had big plans for hotels and golf courses and even touristic routes, right? So they were planning on doing direct flights from Beijing to Havana and having a tour of Santiago, right? Sort of the cradle of communism. So you could sort of, ideological, you could have sort of a focus on ideology, and none of that has planned out. But, Cuba has been hit very, very hard by the pandemic, by sanctions from the US, and is just not in a very good place. Perhaps in a distant future that could happen, but I think China's prospects in other Caribbean countries are much stronger. So back to you, Earl and Rasheed, on the US ramping up efforts to contain China. This is a question on US-China relations. So what do those look like?
I'm happy to start. I think that, if I could frame US and China in terms of opportunities versus challenges, I would say there's more challenges versus opportunities. And I think that the Biden administration really came in with having to defend that they were not going to essentially continue the Obama type policies. And in many ways, were forced to take a much stronger position vis-a-vis China, and continue a number of policies that the Trump administration had put in place. And so I think that's critically important to understand, that the United States understands that it cannot engage and go toe-to-toe one-on-one versus China. And so you're seeing them engage in a much more multilateral approach vis-a-vis China. You see this with ANCUS, the strategic partnership with the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. You're also seeing this strategy play out in terms of the Quad with the United States, India, Japan, and Australia as well. I think these two multilateral frameworks will really define for the next decade how the United States will, quote unquote, try to contain China utilizing a multilateral framework.
Rasheed, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
I guess I'd say that. So I'm currently in DC. When I'm in DC, all day, every day, all I have is conversations with people at state and various other institutions. And I have to say, you get less and less optimistic when you're in DC about the US-China relations, because people are very ignorant about a lot of the issues, and not because they're stupid, they're extremely smart, but for different institutional reasons, they don't have any expertise in the problems. They don't have any expertise on China. They don't have any expertise in the regions that they're talking about. And it's very hard to get it at this point. And the actual institutional bureaucracy doesn't allow itself to get these kind of expertise flowing through into policy making. And it is quite apparent, and for most institutions here are quite behind. And that's not to say China's ahead; they're definitely not. But the problem is that China's kind of waiting game. Oftentimes, again, that's not always. It's a big discussion there in itself. But I don't think that the U.S.-China relationship is going to get any better in the next few years. There's definitely only going to get worse. But at the same time, is that going to be a bad thing or a good thing for the Caribbean? It's mostly going to be a bad thing.
Yeah. So I'll disagree slightly with Rasheed. I think that where we look in the next, as we head into bilateral, kind of midterm elections, I think that the Biden administration can say very clearly, look, we've been tough on China for the last 2 years. And I think that because you see Biden so weak at home, particularly with not being able to get through their Build Back Better program, I think that this actually and you see China really hurting economically from a variety of different factors. I think this presents actually a great opportunity where the United States and China can form some kind of economic agreement, some kind of free trade agreement that can help farmers, particularly in the United States, because Biden knows that he's quite weak at home and can utilize this as a foreign policy objective to kind of help him domestically at home.
But I think the problem with that interpretation is that when you have all of your institutions aligned in a particular way, so then like trying to adjust the institutional directions will take at least 2 administrations more, right? So even if you wanted to kind of let's stop all the China programs and China initiatives, that will take years to filter through the administration.
No, I mean, you saw this with the Trump administration, right? I mean, you saw in the first year, Trump extremely, this trade war, and it's very unpredictable kind of policy as well. And then what did you see? Immediately within a year, we're gonna, announce the biggest, deal with China that you've ever seen. I think that you have American interest groups such as American Chamber of Commerce and a variety of interest groups that are banging on the administration's door saying we want stronger economic relations with China. And at some point, the administration has to listen to them because in one sense, they foot the bill in terms of campaign money, number one. Number two, farmers, when you look at how Biden got elected, it's through a number of these constituencies. So I think you're going to see some kind of economic engagement within, in the foreseeable future.
I love that positive outlook on this. I'm of the opinion that we'll probably be here in a year having this very same conversation, but let's hope not. Anyway, thank you so much for doing this. We're over time. I always like to end with a bit of a wild card. So very, very quickly, we didn't get to delve into specific investments as much as I would have liked to. I'm a sucker for color and detail. So if you could both just give me biggest winner, Chinese investment in the Caribbean, or biggest loser, a surprising investment that did really well or did really poorly, any country you'd like, any type of investment, just give us that last whiff of what these investments look like, and then we can call it a night.
Rasheed, would you like to go first?
Something surprising, not a stadium,
sure.
not a hospital, something different.
Just before I say that, just a bit to point clear. Although I am less optimistic about like DC policy making things, I am extremely optimistic about the prospects of the US as a whole, but not regarding foreign policy. We'll comment. Now, in terms of investment in the Caribbean, I don't think there's anything to be too surprising to you. I think really one of the biggest things that has happened really was that big Bahamar hotel in the Bahamas that had some extreme scandalous news, and it got dragged through the mud in the US courts. It got dragged through the mud in Bahamian courts. It got dragged through the mud in Chinese press, and now it's open as employing quite a lot of people.
Okay, Earl, thank you. I'll let the rest of you Google that. If you haven't heard about it, we'll leave you with that bit of intrigue. What got dragged through the mud in 3 countries? Go ahead.
I would say, for me in Jamaica, the superhighway, when people take that highway and they see, built by China, it really has an important, impact on people when they see that. So I would say that will continue to be a huge success for the Chinese in terms of a public image, and we'll see if that can be a model that can be replicated in other countries in the Caribbean.
And are Jamaicans speeding down it in convertible BYDs?
They are definitely speeding down it. Let's just leave it at that.
All right, sounds good. Well, we will leave it at that. Thank you so much to the China Institute, to Dinda, to Aaron, and of course to you, Earl and Rasheed, for sharing all of this. We could have gone on for much longer. Safe travels to you, Rasheed, tonight, and hopefully we'll reconvene in the Caribbean somewhere. Thank you very much.